bringing you another fine podcast from Art Report Today.
My name is Michael Delgado, and I'm on special assignment for Art Report Today. My interview with the internationally renowned artist Larry Bell is part of an expansive look into the work and life of the art world's premier collaborator and fabricator, Jack Brogan. Over a 70-year career, Jack has been the go-to magician for many of the light and space artists like Larry Bell, who over many years has worked with Jack on the conservation of his signature glass sculptures. You can find out more info about Jack and his significant contribution to contemporary art in several features in Art Report Today. On the phone, just days ago, I had the pleasure of catching up with the lively Bell and his great sense of humor at his Taos, New Mexico studio. Bell recently celebrated his 80th birthday, and he shows no signs of slowing down. Throughout his career, Bell has experimented with the nature of surface and its relationship to space. His work in large geometric compositions and freestanding glass structures is familiar to so many because so much of his work graces the permanent collections of numerous internationally recognized museums and institutions. Although the impetus of the interview was about Jack, and toward the end of the interview we talk about Jack's particular mastery, we use the opportunity to talk about Bell's work, the LA and New York art scenes in the 60s and 70s, his transition from painting to sculpture, and the role of chance in making art and in our lives. Larry Bell, welcome to Art Report Today.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Yeah. As you know, I live in Los Angeles. I actually live very close to MoCA, and so I was thrilled when they recently acquired and installed that piece in their sculpture courtyard, and I've had the pleasure of being able to experience it at different times of the day. And
great.
Yeah, I you'd probably do a better job describing it than I would. So if you would indulge me.
No, I can't describe my stuff.
All right, I'll give it a stab. The piece is called Bill and Coup, which refers to a silly kids movie in the 1940s. And because, like many of Bell's pieces, it's named by the first thing that pops into his head when someone asks, "What do you call it?" Like Bell himself, the piece cuts an imposing but somehow approachable figure in the courtyard. It's composed of two large glass cubes, each of which contain two additional cubes, each standing roughly 8 feet square. Coated in subtle, different reddish, rose-like hues, the piece shifts in between shadow and light throughout the day, taking on different aspects and prompting the viewer to ponder a wide range of emotion. At noon, when there are no shadows, the piece sort of disappears and reappears as it reflects and interacts with the museum's architecture and the surrounding cityscape. During the time Los Angeles photographers call golden hour, the moment in the minutes just after sunset when light is magically diffused, nearby skyscrapers rake shadows across the piece at amazing angles. The gradient hues of red flood the plaza, turning the piece into both an instrument of, as well as a manipulator of daylight. At night, they're ingeniously lit such that they sort of glow and radiate and seem to take on a life of their own.
You see, you can describe it 1,000 times better than I could.
Well, I don't know about that. I ventured to share with Larry a takeaway thought from the last time I visited the piece at sunset. At the risk of sounding like a fanboy, I said I thought that one of the things that's often left out of the discussion of light and space art is the dimension of time. I said if you spent more than the usual stop-and-pause museum moment to say, "Oh, look, a Larry Bell," and actually watched the play of light and shadow over a period of, say, an hour, you became aware of time as a celestial construct, and that this added a spiritual dimension to the work. He wasn't so sure.
Huh.
I don't know if that was intended at all, but
thank you very much. I love your description of it. It's great. And also, time is one of the time in in a certain way, is a lot like the right angle. It's always everywhere at once. And I hadn't thought of what you just described as an inherent part of the piece, but I love the fact that the piece stimulated you to engage that thought. It means I did my job right.
Part of doing his job right, according to Larry, is about improvisation. Larry views himself and his work as all ad hoc all the time. Artists are often the last people to see what's actually going on in their work, so it was my turn to not be so sure. I told him I was surprised to hear him say in previous interviews that his work was all about mixing it up and improvising, when his work is so obviously engineered, meticulously constructed. Little could be really left to chance if he were to realize his initial vision. He, of course, put me in my place nicely, because that's just his way.
Well, that doesn't preclude spontaneity.
Well, I mean, if you think about improvisation, I mean, like usually associated with, sort of a slapdash in the moment jazz kind of thing, as opposed to things that are, highly constructed or like planned out and have, assistance doing pieces ahead of time. And
I think when you've worked with in a certain format for long enough, just about any decision you make is spontaneous and improvisational, because it's no longer, the mechanics of it are no longer an issue. And so everything is spontaneous, even though it's square.
Right.
The ground is flat too, and so there's another element that I was given, and in fact, it's quite important to the structure of the pieces that the floor is flat, and if the floor is flat, I can put them anywhere. That's spontaneity at work.
Larry's trust in spontaneity might just be a product of the good fortune that seems to have come out of some happy accidents, or at least odd turns of luck. Two stories in particular come to mind. The first involves a time when Larry was enrolled at the Chouinard Art Institute, as part of the now legendary class that included many of the stars who would come to define a generation of West Coast artistry. Masters such as Robert Irwin, Billy Al Bankston, John Altoon, Ed Ruscha, Lynn Folks, and Joe Good, just to name a few. There, in a drawing class taught by a sort of Obi-Wan character named Herbert Jepson, Larry experienced an epiphany. Interpreting Jepson's instruction in a way Jepson couldn't understand, Larry solidified his direction as an artist, but also caused Jepson to have him evaluated by the school psychiatrist. Jepson's reaction to his work precipitated Larry's exit from Chouinard and set him on a different path. I suggested to Larry that odd luck seemed to be part of his success.
Remembering back at the time, everybody had a spiritual feeling about Jepson, and on the walls of his class were drawings done by former students, and they looked like they could have been done by a single person. They all were very similar. And so when people came into the class and sat down and started drawing the figure, the influence of how to do it was there on the walls. It was the work of prior students. However, Jepson talked about a certain, as he walked around the room looking at people's work, he talked about a certain kind of energy flow that existed in the work, that once you started drawing, the drawings had a kind of a spiritual energy that finished them. Well, I interpreted that as meaning that everybody in the room misunderstood what Jepson was talking about. It had nothing to do with the figure or the stuff that was around the room. It had to do with a kind of sensibility that had to do with the tactile, hands-on aspect of drawing, which could be anything. It didn't have to be the figure. It could be anything. And I just, when I realized that everybody else was doing the wrong thing, I started doing something that I thought was the right thing. And that's when Jepson noticed me.
Chouinard in those days was a grooming ground for Disney animators, and if not for Jepson's reaction, Larry might have been indentured to the studio system. Larry begged to differ and told me something I didn't know about him.
No, I doubt it. Because I'm really not fit for employment, and I didn't realize it. I didn't realize that then. I was born with a severe hearing loss that wasn't diagnosed until I was 46. I did terrible in school. I did, and the few little jobs I had, I got fired from all of them because I didn't hear when I was told to do this or that. So consequently, since I grew up not being able to hear things, I never learned how to listen. But, my mind would wander and that's just the way it was. There wasn't much chance of my being in a very disciplined kind of, job thing where you had to do something that you were paid for.
The second time in which a chance wind seemed to blow Larry's boat in an auspicious direction was on the occasion of his first exhibition at Pace Gallery in New York. Pace, in the early 60s, was emerging as an important gallery, and it would stand with Leo Castelli and others of the time in showcasing a new crop of decidedly American artists. Testament to its management and vision, Pace is still a powerhouse today. Anxious to install his first New York show, Bell found that several of his glass sculptures had arrived broken. Forced to find another industrial resource that used his particular process of coating glass, Larry came upon someone who would become instrumental in the next phase of his career.
And you had some pieces delivered from here in L.A., and they arrived broken, and because of that, you had to scramble and find somebody in New York
to fix them.
Or you had to fix them, and it turns out that by chance, this person then helps you acquire equipment and teaches.
Well, he said to me, I'll never forget. He said to me, it's crazy. After we paid him, the gallery put up the money to get this guy to do this thing. Put the pieces I made had been made over a period of, 2 years or something like that. And so the nice guy who did the coatings for me let me pay when I could and so on. But the fellow who did the emergency repair, he was a novelty metallizer in the Bronx. It's just that the guy who did my work in Los Angeles originally was an optical coater, but the technique was exactly the same. It was just the use of the process that was different. And the novelty metallizer, after he was finished doing my project, he said, it's crazy for you to spend this kind of money to do this. He says, why don't you get a piece of equipment and do it yourself? And I told him I didn't know anything about I never even held a wrench in my hand. I didn't know anything about this kind of equipment, He says, it's easy. There's nothing to it. And I happen to have an old coder we're not using, and I'll sell it to you cheap. Well, the words rang in my ears, and I went back to the gallery. The show was very successful, and I just and they wanted me to stay in New York, so I decided I'd buy the equipment with the money that we got from the sales of the work, and the gallery was very helpful with whatever else it took to get a studio operating in New York.
Larry would spend time in New York, but never really left home. Personally, I'm fascinated by the LA of the early 60s when it seemed to be bristling with both potential and conflict. A post-war boom, a vibrant music scene, old studio systems giving way to independent filmmakers, civil rights clashes. It was the days of the Ferris Gallery, the Chenard Institute, LA's first folk music joint, the Unicorn. It was Lenny Bruce. It was Dennis Hopper. I asked Larry if that period affected his self-awareness as an artist.
It was a very rich time because of the participants in the scene I was in. They were the funniest people I'd ever met in my life, and we all functioned because of the level of humor that operated between us, and there was no better time because there was no funnier people to be around, and that's as simple as that. As far as what each of the artists did, their personal trip and so on, that was their trip. We didn't have to try and, nobody had to. The influence we each had over the other had nothing to do with what we made, with how we respected each other. That's it.
And so naming names, and that would be Billy Al Bankston.
Yeah, Billy Al, John Altoon, Robert Irwin, Ken Price, Ed Moses, Craig Kaufman. Just about all the people that hung around the Ferris Gallery, and including the people that ran the Ferris Gallery. There was nobody goofier than Walter Hopps in the art scene, and probably nobody stand-up funnier than Irving Blum. And and that's, speaking just for me, that's what tied me to wanting to pursue. If the rest of the art world was as funny as the immediate guys that I hung out with, then that's the world I wanted to hang around in.
In LA, Larry was working for the Unicorn, LA's first folk music venue. A crappy little coffee house, a shoebox sliver of a space on Sunset Boulevard next to what, in the next year, would become the famed Whiskey A Go-Go. In the heart of underground Hollywood, the Unicorn was hip, avant-garde. They hosted poets like Maya Angelou and comedians like none other than Lenny Bruce.
Lenny would bring people out of the woodwork to hear him. In those days, he was the underground talent that, people would travel 100 miles to hear this guy, to be in the presence of this guy, because he was so incredibly funny. And again, there's humor. That's probably the most addictive force there is humor. And he was supposed to come on at 8:00 for his first set and do 45 minutes, and then he'd get down and they would get a new house, the people would leave and so on. Well, at 11:00 in the evening, he was still on his first set. And finally, they just shut off the lights and dragged him off the stage, and he went into a bit like he was being taken to the electric chair, The audience loved it. They thought it was just all part of his thing, and when in fact it wasn't.
The crowd wouldn't leave, and the people standing on line were getting hostile. The punchline to this story involves Larry being pressed into service as an entertainer.
I went upstairs to this little office that was the owner's office, and I said to the owner, his name is Herb Cohen, I said, "Herbie, nobody's left." And Lenny was sitting in an office kind of chair, shaking like just shaking. And so Herbie said, let's go downstairs. So we went down, and he looks at the room, and he says, "Did you bring your guitar?" I said, "It's in the car." He said, "Do a set." So I've got the guitar and started to sing one of my self-composed songs, and before it was finished halfway, the house was empty. And
This is why you pursued.
They didn't like my shit at all.
So Larry avoided a music career.
Had they liked it, you might have pursued music instead of sculpture.
No, it eventually would have failed me because I couldn't hear worth shit. I didn't know how to tune my guitar. You know, I mean, I made up the goofiest songs. You know, like it's hard to be blind, and oh Lord, spiders everywhere. Those are two titles that I remember. And
around that time, another group of artists was congregating in the Topanga Canyon area of L.A. Artists like Wallace Berman, Dennis Hopper, and Neil Young would come to represent all that was good and evil of L.A.'s Eden. I was curious if Larry and that clique had crossed paths.
I knew Dennis, and I knew Wally. He showed at the Ferris Gallery,
right.
And he was a friend. I didn't know him very well. He was a good friend, or seemed like he was a good friend of Bankston's and Kenny's and all of those people that I admired so much. And he was quite pleasant to me whenever we were at a party or an opening together. And so, you know, I considered him a friend. He certainly wasn't an enemy. He was part of a group of people that I profoundly respected, and the same went for Dennis, who was, you know, he was the only movie star I ever knew, really, and when he was married to Brooke Hayward, they was the first person to buy a sculpture of mine.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Now, he had a compound or something out in Taos, didn't he? Was that before or after you did?
No. He got here before I did, and I moved out here in '73, and I think he was up here around '69.
Dennis had bought the famed Mabel Dodge Lujan house that had been renamed the Big House by locals, and he settled in for over a decade of bohemian life.
He was a little bit like Andy Warhol in that he paid a lot of whatever money he had to keep his scene going, and that meant feeding a lot of sycophants, you know, that were part of his scene.
Speaking of Warhol, Larry was also immersed in the vibrant East Coast scene and would frequent the infamous Max's Kansas City bar in Soho.
That was the best bar I ever went to, ever. The owner was a fantastic guy, a guy named Mickey Ruskin, and I don't know what the word is for a master of ceremonies.
Impresario.
Exactly that. And his word was law, is in the way he ran his place. Nobody crossed him, and anybody who crossed him was thrown out the door. And if he didn't like the way his clients looked when they came to the front door, he wouldn't let them in. And he spent most of his time outside filtering his clientele. People would want to come to people from the Bronx or from New Rochelle or someplace like that would show up to be in a weird place. And he wouldn't let them in. He'd just say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're full." And as 5 or 6 of these people were turning away, 4 of the scuzziest people you can even imagine seeing would walk in, and he'd open the door for them, you know. And so the sad thing was that a lot of guys were into drugs that killed them, and they were part of the clientele, and that included Mickey, the guy who owned the place. He OD'd.
The original impetus of the interview was to get Larry's take on Jack Brogan, who's been so integral to the art making of so many artists, and to the restoration of their work, including that of Larry Bell. And so I asked Larry to tell me about how he and Jack had worked together over the years. Turns out, Larry is a conservator's nightmare.
When Jack would call me to say he's working on something a certain size, I would just send him the proper glass parts coated, and he would put them on. I wouldn't charge him anything. I like the idea that the pieces will still exist, but if they're broken, they should be restored. You get the picture of what I'm saying?
Yeah, what it was making me think of was whether what you do is repeatable. Like if you've documented these things, so like if you make a particular piece and it breaks, you can go, oh, that was panel X, and I used this evaporation process, and it would be the same. Or if there's, as you mentioned, chance before, if there's no way to really control it that precisely.
Well, not the way I do it. There's no way. There are people that know what they're doing, but I try and not know what I'm doing, and what you see is the evidence of me not knowing what I'm doing, and that's and I like my life like that.
Michael Delgado for Art Report Today.
This has been a production of Art Report Today. Find your inspiration in the arts every day at artreporttoday.com.